Welcome to the FinTech One-on-One podcast. This is Peter Renton, co-founder of FinTech Nexus and now the CEO of the FinTech consulting company Renton & Co. I've been doing this show since 2013, which makes this the longest running one-on-one interview show in all of FinTech. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Now let's get on with the show. Today on the show, I'm delighted to welcome Oban MacTavish. He is the CEO and co-founder of Spade. Now, Spade is in the data enrichment business for card transactions. Did you know that when you're doing a card transaction, only 45 characters of data can be sent from the merchant that is supposed to give all the information about that transaction? And that's a problem that has existed for decades since this standard was created back in the 1980s. And there's a better way. And that's what Spade is really doing here. They've figured out a way to really enrich the data, take those 45 characters and provide a really rich data set back to whoever needs it. Obviously great for anti-fraud, but also for all kinds of use cases, which we do get into in some depth in this episode. Really interesting. Learned a lot about credit card data in this episode, and I'm sure you will too. It was a fascinating discussion. Hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the podcast, Oban.
Thank you. Great to meet you, Peter.
Good to meet you as well. So let's kick it off by giving the listeners a little bit of background. Why don't you tell us some of the highlights of your career to date?
My career.
Your storied and long career, yes. I know you're pretty young.
I studied finance. I fell in love with investing when I was really young and invested my way through college. And then when I spent my summers working at a SaaS company in sort of like an FP&A, like finance type intern role, I did a little bit of sales when I was there too. It was just a company in the Bay Area, and I think I really kind of fell in love with the magic of Silicon Valley. And I say that living in New York now, so I guess that says something. But I think there's something really cool about being at a tech company. And as I graduated, I was really trying to decide between like an investment banking path, the very standard finance graduate idea of what a career looks like, or something a little different. And I started my first company right out of college. I was one of the co-founders of a business called Hubly. We built efficiency technology for wealth managers. So think like vertical SaaS before vertical SaaS had a huge moment. It was really challenging. I learned a lot about what not to do with your first company. And I wasn't the CEO, but I spent most of my time trying to figure out how we made money in vertical SaaS. So very much like, okay, we signed a financial advisory firm. Like, what are all the ways you can actually generate revenue from working with them? And then COVID-19 happened as we were raising a seed. We had raised about, I don't know, 400K or something like that beforehand, or 600K. And we had no money left in the bank. And I decided, the co-founders sat down, we had to lay everyone off, and we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do next. And we tried to decide on like a direction to go. And I was looking at it being like, I don't know. I didn't see it anymore. I didn't have that spark.
Right.
So I left, and it was a really hard decision, but I left and I started figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. I briefly flirted with the idea of going to an investment bank or a hedge fund or something like that. And then actually I sort of caught the bug again, and I saw what I thought was, and still believe is, one of the biggest opportunities in fintech, and that would later become Spade. So that's the Sparks Notes version of my career in a very, very short little blip, but that's where we are today.
Okay, so let's dig into the decision to start Spade. What did you see? What was the huge opportunity that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah. So I really recognized that there was something fundamentally wrong with transaction data. And I focused on the card universe, in that I realized if you think about it, card payments aren't going away. We have these magical things in our wallet that get this instant access to debt. You can buy something like accepted pretty much anywhere in the entire world. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, banks are still communicating on a protocol that was really designed in like the 60s through 80s and has been only changed a couple of times, called the ISO 8583. And the vast majority of card data is transmitted along this protocol. There's a slightly more modernized version, but it didn't really fix the fundamental problem, which is that this protocol was designed before we had e-commerce. It was designed in a time when a POS system was probably the best way for you to identify a business, because you walk into a mom and pop shop, you have this single POS system that's representative. But the reality is that the merchant ID that the networks give you is a single POS system, which means somebody like a Walmart has 50,000 plus IDs, which makes banks have a really hard time to do a lot of the stuff we assume they're able to do. Stop
Right.
fraud, understand where their customers are spending their money, give you the reward money that you're owed because they're promising you 5% cash back on gas. And what I realized was that I felt like it was just such a no-brainer. Like, why don't we have better data about card payments? As I started digging into it, I realized it's a really complicated problem to solve, and there were people trying to solve it in what I felt was the wrong way. And I was like, if we could help every single card payment be that much better and help them unlock, what I would describe as like mission critical and really high value use cases for their customers, like that'd be an enormous business. If you're helping every single bank, every single card payment on the planet, and you're sort of attaching you're attaching your cart to a horse that is moving very, very quickly and up and to the right, it was a really compelling opportunity to me because you'd be solving like a really critical problem for one of the biggest markets on the planet, which is financial services.
That makes sense to me. But maybe before we dive into the details, I would like you to explain how the card payments value chain works. Take us through the steps involved from when you swipe your card or tap your card
Yeah.
all the way through to getting your statement.
Yeah, so I'll take a little bit of this is obviously a really complicated process with a lot of different players involved, and there's also like interchangeability, right? Like some people use somebody like a Square, other who technically, has somebody sitting underneath them, and there's acquiring banks and everything like this. Like there's a lot of complexity here. So I'll just give like what I like to have I have like a simplified version of this in my head that we think about it, there's like a consumer and a merchant. And if you think
Yep.
of the simplest way to think about it is the consumer has a card, they tap their card at the POS system, or when you type your card in online, a decision has to be made. The merchant says, like, is this a legitimate customer? Is this like, did they put in their PIN right? If it's online, did they put in like, their address correctly? So that, the people on the payment processing side say, yeah, we're good to go. Stripe says, okay, the record that we have for this consumer is that, they put in their address. That's all good. Then the merchant says we're good to go. They pass along the data. So they're sending a payload to the network. The network sends it to the right bank, the issuing bank, who gave you your card, Chase.
Mm-hmm.
And now Chase says, okay, does Peter have enough money in his bank account? Is Peter overdrawn? Is this behavior normal for Peter? Do we think this is really actually, does he normally spend this much money online? What have you, right? They say good to go. Then the money gets pulled and like everything happens after that. But the really important facet of this is that like the moment you swipe a card, a lot of people have to say, yes, this is good. Yes, this is a legitimate transaction. And I think a really important note of that is that there's actually really different incentives from all sides. The merchant, they make a lot of money. If they're a 90% gross margin business like software, and you're putting in your card to buy like $10,000 worth of, Figma for your company, they're making 90% gross margin on this. They're very happy. They're like, what are the odds that it's really fraud? And how much is fraud really going to cost us? So we're going to unwind this whole thing and there's some cost there. Banks, on the other hand, are actually really disincentivized. They're like, oh my gosh, are we sure that this is really Peter? Like if the trust lost, if your bank authorizes a transaction that wasn't you, that's really, really painful. And they're still making that really critical decision. Like, do I want to authorize this transaction or not? But I guess the way you can think about it is that data goes from the merchant and the payment processor to the network. The network gives them scores. They say, hey, do we think this is pretty good? They pass it along to the bank, who then says, yes, we're good to go on this transaction. And then all the money starts changing hands. And that's a really simplified version of it all. But that's sort of how I like to think about it. It's almost like a big communication where it goes merchant, payment processor, network, issuing bank.
Right. So obviously this is a mature system. You said yourself, the standards were created decades ago, but
Yeah.
it works for the most part. I mean, everyone's swiping their card left, right, and center. So what's the problem? What did you identify as being the thing that really needs to improve?
Yeah. So the concepts, I guess, like if you think about it, banks used to, it's quite simple. Like, hey, we're just going to like move your money. We're going to hold your money. We're going to lend you some money and everything's going to be good. But financial needs have gotten more complicated. The quality and the products that we're trying to launch are far more interesting. Maybe we want to understand like where a customer spends their money and give them rewards. Maybe we want to, be better at stopping fraud, because now like the way people attack banks from a fraud perspective is just dramatically different. And I think I recognize that like if you look at the standard, you have around 45 characters to tell the bank everything they could ever want to know about a merchant. That's it, 45 characters.
Right.
And then you get a 4-digit MCC code, merchant category code. And that's crazy. Like, we can just stop there for a second and say, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
45 characters is nowhere near enough context in the world we live in today when anyone can pretty much spin up a virtual POS system. There's websites, there's phone numbers, there's contact numbers. What did the person buy? Why isn't there a receipt? What does this business even do? And we're going to put them into an MCC code that is completely, it's a standard that is completely unregulated. There's no reason you have to. And POS providers and payment service providers and the Squares and the Stripes and stuff will do their best to try to make sure you're putting in the right one. But how do they know? And the lines are pretty blurry. Is a cannabis dispensary there's no MCC code for cannabis. There is an MCC code for a pharmacy, though. So you have these situations where not only is this it's a very small amount of context, you also have very little verification of the data. That's all the bank has to work with. And then you get a MID, which is a merchant ID, which is a 15-character alphanumeric code that's supposed to represent the business. This is sort of like a classic move that banks leverage, where they're like, if they see a lot of disputes on a MID, they're like, we're going to block it. And that used to work. That used to work when you were a store and maybe, you were stealing cards and then you would swipe them at your store to take some cash out of the system. Problem is, your MID gets blocked. You're just going to create a new one by opening a new payment account with a new online platform. And so you're really looking at a system where there's very little verification. You have very little ability to add additional context, and it's all being relied on for really mission critical processes like fraud detection, authorization, rewards, etc. And I think we fundamentally recognize that you need to be able to add context. And context is what sort of frees up businesses to do these really, really interesting things. That's how you could do really targeted advertising to your customer, a really detailed partnership, geographic-based authorization, better fraud detection. And all of this stuff is just consumer benefit. And banks are sort of hamstrung by the underlying data they rely on. And it's why, you look at something like a Mint, that was via Plaid, notoriously horrible categorization.
Yeah.
Notoriously bad. Everyone can say that. But we have a customer who leverages our data to make accounting decisions for their customers. And they have less than a 0.01% recategorization rate. And I'm just so proud of that, because I'm like, the amount of time that saves and the beauty of that product is driven by our underlying data. I think that's just a great example of why you need more context and more accurate verified data about businesses.
Right. More context would be great. And if you were designing a system from scratch today, you would not design something for 45 characters. But back in the 60s when this was being started, I imagine that was as much as the systems could handle back then. What does Spade do exactly? How are you able to kind of add some of the enhancements you've already talked about?
In essence, we've built a data network of merchant information. We have coverage of 99.9% of card accepting businesses in the United States. And then, so we have this massive verified structured database of businesses. And then we combine that with a layer of matching technology that we've built in-house, where you send us the payloads you get from the ISO 8583, those 45 characters, the MID, the amount of information, the MCC code, all those really bad pieces of information. And then in real time, and when I say real time, I mean truly real time, we have a P99 of under 40 milliseconds. We will send you back all of this really detailed firmographic and insights-driven data. So if you can think of us like a data company. We combine best-in-class data sources, information we get from our customers, and all sorts of other data to create this merchant profile that we then match transactions to, and then we throw all that data at you. And we give you all of the context you could ever want about a business. Rather than, there's lots of people who will give you lots of information about your customers. They'll tell you who they are, their behaviors. They'll put an SD can on an iPhone and get some other information. We're really focused on that merchant context because we think that's a massive block in a lot of what, traditional fraud approaches and rewards programs are all really driven by how can we increase merchant information? Right.
So 99.9%, that's a pretty high percentage. You're still a fairly young company. How were you able to do that? I'm just so curious to know that this is something that, it doesn't sound like a trivial problem when I'm just thinking about it.
Sometimes I've thought about this, and I think we were uniquely lucky in that oftentimes I think problems are best solved by small companies who pose no threat to anybody.
Right.
I think sometimes when you're big, it becomes very difficult to solve data problems because there's always some type of competition. There are places you can acquire data, whether that be like someone who normally sells data, someone who doesn't normally sell data for your use cases, that it becomes very compelling to a person to say, hey, like, who are we? We're just a small company. We've raised almost no money. Like, you can get yourself into these sort of high leverage situations where you don't pose a threat to anybody and you become in some ways a category defining use case for this data. And whether that be people like POI data providers, data from within the payments value chain itself, data from businesses who collect merchant data and are a place that merchants go to put information about themselves, state registries. Like the reality is that taking it all in and finding that data was hard, but the real challenge, I think what we did that was unique was the ability to stick it all together in a way that's digestible and infrastructure that's performant. And I wish I could be like, oh, it was this like special trick, but really it was just like banging on every door and
Just
asking
hustling.
everyone I knew and hustling and trying to find someone who knew somebody who knew somebody and finding the right person at that organization who is saying, yeah, you know what? Okay, like we'll sign a deal, we'll sign it for a long time, and we're not going to worry about it.
This is obviously it's a very dynamic database. There's businesses being opened up every day. There's businesses shutting down every day.
Yeah.
Is this like an API driven process where you're updating the merchant database in real time?
Well, we update it constantly, but it's not API driven. So
Uh,
one of the approaches we took was that many of these businesses that we worked with, APIs weren't the first choice of delivery. There was flat files. And then additionally, leveraging other people's APIs sort of puts in points of failure. And if you look at these very robust systems, even the bank tech stacks, like most of the time your bank actually doesn't just go down. You know what I mean?
right.
Because there's very few points of failure. They have them oftentimes will have a mainframe sitting somewhere, all the technology is in one place. It's they're not calling out to APIs all the time. And so we don't leverage any APIs in any of our enrichment. We have our own database. We receive flat files of data and we process it all in-house. And then there's no sort of other points of failure beyond our own infrastructure. So we're constantly updating the data, whether that be from data vendors, whether that be our own data sources, whether that be feedback from customers. I mean, we're so lucky to have customers who send us information about their transactions, whether we get it right or wrong, and say like, hey, this is where this actually took place, and we can fix that. And it's funny. I think we probably have the most accurate latitudes and longitudes of businesses on the planet. There's oftentimes we'd see like Google Maps says one thing, and we're like, we know that's not true. And we've actually gone back to our customers and be like, I promise you this is wrong. Like I know like an analyst on your team pulled up Google Maps and said Spade was wrong, but I promise you, we have like truck data. We know where the truck physically was and it was on top of this pin. And that's like it's a very unique business to be in.
Okay, so then can you explain like who are you selling to and what are you actually selling? Maybe take us through some of the use cases.
So we can sell to anyone who issues a card or really provide services to people who issue cards. So that means it could be banks, fintech companies. Those are probably the two buckets, but think about anyone who issues a card. In terms of what we do, we provide an API that allows you send us the bad data and we send you good data and insights. So there's both sort of firmographic data, think like factual information about a business. Where does it exist? What did they do? When were they, how long they've been around and all sorts of facts like that. And then there's insights driven things, which is a new area for us where we're starting to provide our customers generally risk focused insights like how long has this business been around and been operating? Do they have a long history of accepting payments? What's their website say? Is their website covered in stuff that makes it really correlated with disputes? So there's those two buckets. It's a very simple API. You send us data, we send you stuff back in real time, instantaneously. And then in terms of customers, I mean, we work with people like S&P 500 companies like Corpay, or I guess formerly known as FleetCor. They do a lot of sort of work in the logistics and trucking space. They also do corporate cards and a whole host of other issuing types use cases. And then we work with some people like Stripe, which is obviously a really exciting person to be working with. And then we work with some sort of like up and coming fintech people who are doing really great in their own right. People like Mercury, Unit, and others. So we really run the gambit of if you issue a card, you probably need better data and you should be working with us.
Is fraud like your number one use case, or is that what are the top use cases?
So I like to bucket them into a couple places. There's authorization, attribution, and then everything else. And fraud generally falls into the authorization side. So it's by far our largest use case for our customers is Whether that be you want to run a fraud model and you're trying to, you're plugging in a bunch of data into a model and the model is spitting out yes, no, whether that be in the trucking space, geographic based authorization, where you in real time compare truck GPS location data or driver location data to where Spade is telling you this business is located. So you just measure the distance. So you know for a fact the driver is there or the truck is there. I mean, that's an incredible superpower. I mean, that stops account takeover, someone stealing someone's card. It stops, drivers potentially abusing their fuel card and fueling up their own personal vehicles. And that's a big use case for us as well. That's fraud usually follows into that bucket. And then there's attribution. Think like rewards programs and merchant payouts. So rewards are becoming increasingly complicated. And the exciting part about it is that, like, as a consumer, you can do all sorts of stuff. I think everyone loves, I know Chase and Amex are really on the cutting edge where you click them, you're on your web portal and you're like, I want 5% cash back at this, or I want $20 back here. Everyone has those stories of that not working. And that's not because your bank is trying to scam you. It's because your bank genuinely doesn't know whether or not you've transacted with that merchant, which is a crazy idea. So we help our customers have very accurate rewards and rebate programs with merchants, whether that be helping them say, hey, this is cash back, or hey, this merchant owes me money. Because, whether it be things like, BNPL or other use cases where you're essentially driving volume towards merchants, they owe you based on transaction volume you push your way. And they're not just going to pay you. So you have to prove that to them. And that's a big use case for us as well. And lastly, user experience, sort of unique one-off products, AI and analytics really fall into this bucket of like, whether you want to put a logo on your transaction feed, whether you want to do real-time P&L categorization, there's a whole host of use cases like that are really product driven. Or maybe you want to allow your customer to block certain merchants and only allow a card being spent one place. We don't like to put that in the bucket with fraud, but it's very much product driven. We work really closely with product teams to execute there as well.
What about the companies that are doing this categorization? Like you mentioned Mint, which obviously not really around anymore. Rocket Money does a pretty decent job, and there's lots of these different sort of Personal Capital has or Empower now.
Yeah,
are you helping those types of companies? Because as you say, it's not easy to categorize this stuff properly.
We aren't. I think one of the challenges, as a startup, is always to choose the biggest opportunities and tackle what you can. And I think in the future, we'd love to work with people like that. I think the reality is economics become quite restrictive in those businesses.
Right.
And it creates a dynamic where I think you become quite a commoditized product. And if all you're really doing for someone is helping them categorize, like, let's call it 20% better, 10% better, they're like, how much is it? What's the ROI on that? Versus I go to a bank and I'm like, hey, I'll help you stop 10, 15, 20% more fraud. I mean, that's an incredible, the economic value you create is just enormous. And I think the other part of that is many of these businesses rely on infrastructure players like Plaid or MX or Finicity who've built walled gardens. Right. Like, I think they've built an incredible product, but they've made decisions to essentially limit the data that's being shared and the cleanliness, and they have their own enrichment products. And they've made decisions that they're essentially going to be restricting the raw data from leaving their four walls.
Right. Unless you pay. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that just means that for vendors like us who rely on that raw data, it means we can't work with those customers. And I hope one day to do that and be in an environment where, that's why I think I'm really excited about some of the open banking coming down the pipeline, because my hope would be that with, common sense regulation of an industry like this, that the data being shared will be the raw data, and it will help open up that market for us in a really exciting way, because we're not going to rely on a party who is incentivized to prevent competitive products from being able to operate within their own market.
No, I could see that being, that could be a huge unlock for you guys.
Absolutely.
Maybe you could explain what you're doing with Stripe exactly. What's the basic deal there?
Unfortunately, I actually can't.
You can't. Okay.
I'm happy to talk about Corpay or a number of other customers, but as of right now, we can't dive too deep into that, but more to come from that side, unfortunately.
Okay. Corpay. What are you doing for those guys?
So I think the best, like Corpay, I think is one of the most interesting because they have a very broad number of use cases. Their organization is sprawling. They offer both like cards designed for fuel, corporate spend. They have, a sprawling network of merchants. And I think one of the big things we would help them with and work with them on is sort of on the attribution side and helping people like Corpay better understand where their customers are spending. such that they can, provide rewards accurately and ensure that their customers are essentially getting the rebates and things like that they rely on. Because the low quality of this data makes situations very difficult. If you're talking, I think they do $120 billion of payments a year. It's an enormous pool of data, and trying to figure out which merchant all these transactions belongs to ensure that everyone is properly getting the discounts that they're owed is an incredibly challenging problem, and one we're really excited to be working with an incredibly large company to help solve. On top of that, there's also very exciting opportunities in things like proximity authorization, there's different, parts of their infrastructure where they leverage business data to present opportunities of like where you should be spending gas. And that's an area I know they're excited about innovating. And with an organization like Corpay, they really have like both the sort of fraud prevention universe and the proximity authorization, as well as things on the actual attribution side, where we're able to help find revenue. We're able to help ensure that your customer is getting that experience they were promised. And it's, I think they're a great example of why the enterprise is such an exciting place for us to work, because we're a trusted data partner. When you're a big enterprise, the question is often like build versus buy. And, if you have essentially like almost unlimited money, you can hire a lot of people, like you have a lot of dollars to move. The question is like, who's the partner I can trust to help me deploy quickly, get a product in market, and, provide a best-in-class service. And that's really what we provide for them across like a variety of use cases.
And what about the merchant acquirers? Because you said you've really focused on the merchant side of the data. There's all sorts of analytics that could help drive their business forward. I mean, what are you doing on that side?
I'm glad you asked. I think it's one of the, I think it's the area when I get really excited about the future of Spade. I think we're building something very unique in that we're building an alternative pipe directly into the authorization decision of a bank. And we're already working with some folks in the acquiring universe, and I can't say who, to help transport data to improve the merchant outcome. Essentially say, hey, how can we improve authorization rates for your merchants? Is there data we can share? Are there sort of novel products that Spade can build to help your merchants get better outcomes on the bank side? Because oftentimes the people in the acquiring side have a lot more information. They just don't have a way to share it. And we work really closely with some folks there to take that data, transport it in the auth flow, and improve authorization outcomes. And I don't want to get into honestly, the acquiring universe is enormous, and there's countless things we could do there. But I think we're really excited about to play sort of an in between the issuing and the acquiring universe in a really unique way. I don't know if I want to build sort of another competitive KYB product. There's a lot of people doing that, and it's a huge opportunity. But I think we're really excited about playing in the middle here and saying, hey, like some big merchants have really sort of muscled their way into relationships with issuers that have been super accretive to the bottom line by saying we can increase authorization rates, we can reduce false declines, we can reduce disputes. And I think there's a world where every merchant should have the right to make sure that data, if you're a high quality merchant, that should be recognized by the issuing bank. You shouldn't sort of be playing catch up just because you're a mom and pop shop who just opened e-commerce. If you've been processing payments on your same WorldPay POS system that's been around and gone through all those acquisitions and take privates, and you should get credit for that. You're not as risky as a random e-commerce business who popped up with a website that was generated yesterday. And banks just aren't aware. And I think we can play a really valuable role in helping these merchants increase acceptance and reduce false declines, because that really hurts smaller businesses.
Right. So you're saying that right now the status quo is that the established merchant processing payments for 30 years versus the guy who launched a system yesterday and is starting to process payments could be legitimate, obviously. Lots of new businesses get started every day. But you're saying right now that there's no differentiation between those two types of businesses.
I think, there's some level of differentiation, but it's clearly not enough, because I think everyone who's ever spun up a POS system and tried to accept payments via card, the decline rates are just higher. The decline rates in certain industries are higher. And it's actually sprung up a whole world of sort of payment optimization platforms who are really in an arms race with banks trying to trick them. Maybe it's, what if we tried a different MCC code? What if we tried a new mid? Oh, we're going to put the good customers on this mid and the bad customers on this mid. Like, that's like trying to trick someone to let you in the door. And I think one of the challenges that it's a real challenge is that there is no effective and consistent standard to allow for sort of broader communication that's actually sort of, wide enough to allow you to stick more information in there that you wish you could send, because otherwise the bank won't even see it. And I think the problem is that even if a bank has never seen a merchant ID like a mid before, they don't know if it's the person who just, Target opening a new location in New York or if it's mom and pop shop. They don't know that. They can look at a descriptor, but there's no control over what you put in those 45 characters. And the reality is that you're being traded the same way. And I think that is just such a fundamental problem, that there isn't a way to consistently create these IDs. And that's why we actually created what we call a counterparty ID, which is designed to be a permanent ID for a merchant, regardless of what POS system they're using. And our customers can leverage that and say, hey, this is Target. You can be super confident it's a Target, even if it's, the 50,000th and first merchant ID versus like, someone trying to pretend to be Target.
So last question then, you've touched on it, but I'd like you to just maybe spend a little bit more time on it. What's your vision for Spade? Where are you taking it?
I get really excited by the idea of helping merchants and banks improve their payment acceptance and increase authorization and really build an alternative to the ISO 8583. Not that you can replace the card networks. And like, that's not what I'm in the business of doing. I think what Visa and MasterCard have built are like legendary businesses. They provide a real service for people. But I do think there needs to be room. And I almost think of it like, there's a big oil pipe and there's like a parallel pipe that's smaller running next to it that allows people, whether it be merchants, whether it be PSPs, to pass more information, to pass additional context to really help drive payment acceptance. And I really want to end up in a world where not only are we improving transactions with data that we're bringing to the table, insights we're bringing to the table, but there's an opportunity for other people to sort of contribute to that as well. And if you're a merchant, you should be able to sort of get credit for the work you're doing, for the fraud systems you're leveraging, for the scoring you're doing on your transactions to find the good guys. And I think I'd really like, if Spade is successful in the end, the only transactions that are being blocked are fraudulent transactions, and all the good ones are being let in. And I think hopefully we can play a really key role in ensuring that banks have the most accurate verified data on every single card payment. And if that's coming from us, if that's coming from merchants or PSBs or whomever, there should be a place to do that. And I'd like that to be Spade.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. Really great to chat with you, Oban. It's a fascinating space, and you're well on the way to being a major player here. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you so much for listening. Please go ahead and give the show a review on the podcast platform of your choice and go tell your friends and colleagues about it. Anyway, on that note, I will sign off. I very much appreciate you listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.